Welcome to Talent Talks, the podcast where your host Dan Maisie dives into hiring's ins and outs. Our goal is to reveal how to attract top talent. Through interviews with leaders in sports, media and entertainment, we explore job search and recruitment trends, offer interview tips and strategies to differentiate yourself and uncover their hiring insights. Whether you're prepping for an interview or interested in hiring trends, Talent Talks is your essential resource. Let's dive in. I'm thrilled to be sat here with Ben Mercer, a former professional rugby player turned best-selling author, speaker and consultant. Ben's journey from playing rugby in the UK and France with teams such as London Scottish and US Carcassonne to becoming a respected author and consultant provides a wealth of insights into career transitions and personal development. He has penned 3 impactful books, including Fringes, Life on the Edges of Professional Rugby, which offer an insider's perspective on the realities of professional sports. Ben's experience and expertise in performance, teamwork and career development make him a valuable resource for understanding the dynamics of recruitment and team building. Join us as we delve into his experiences, his transition from sport to writing, and his unique perspective on leveraging personal growth for career success. So Ben, welcome to Talent Talks. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Right, we'll get straight into this because I'm excited to get started. As you know, and as the listener knows, we have a starter question that we ask each guest, which tends to focus on their experiences of hiring, being hired, and lessons learned, etc. But I'm going to amend this slightly for you, Ben, so that we can really get into your knowledge and experiences. You've hired people, so I'd still like to kind of get your take on what you look for in that regard, but also from your experiences in professional sport and now consulting with some major clients, what is it that you've seen that makes a good team work, both on the field and off, and what lessons can be taken from your experiences playing rugby that we can bring into the boardroom, as it were?
Well, that is an enormous question. I think, and I touched on it a little bit in Fringes, but I think the best rugby environments I was in were where there was a lot of space for like healthy debate and feedback, and also from the management a sort of respect for your time. So when we used to do review, review happens every week multiple times. There's like a review of the previous game, there'll be a review for the whole team, then for the separate units, then there'll be a preview of the next opponents, pick them apart, let's see what we can do, go practice those things, maybe tweak those strategies a little, then take them into the game. And I think when it doesn't work well, you're all sat there watching clips that are totally unrelated to like you and what you're going to need to do. And so people get very bored. And the other way that badly from the playing perspective is if everyone takes feedback way too personally, or there isn't space for people to kind of chime in what might be a really useful solution from a sort of from somebody else, so who's not the sort of the two parties involved in the discussion. Maybe there might be a teammate who has some really important feedback, but you actually need to create the listening environment and the sort of people talk about psychological safety, that the ability to be able to chime in like that and people not get offended. And I think sport, when it goes well, does that really, really well. And actually in the kind of world of work, it's not something that I've got as much experience in a way. I don't work in like big organizations as an employee, but people say to me, they're like, you don't realize as a sports person how used to being reviewed you are, how good you are at getting feedback. I think the flip side for athletes when they join the world of work is that they're expecting loads of feedback. They want to get better. And I think they don't always get it, and then they don't know what to do without it. So I think it's a sword that cuts both ways.
Yeah, I think that the feedback issue, or challenge, I should say, is a really interesting one, because having gone through many, many, many performance reviews, but also having sat through those sessions, and don't get me wrong, I was never professional, but you find yourself falling asleep, especially after work, and you've got you're in training and you're watching a video that has absolutely nothing to do with anything that you're trying to improve on as a player, but you kind of come to dread, or at least traditionally you kind of come to dread that, right, performance review is up, it's yearly. Now there's a big change to a more kind of consistent and continuous feedback cycle, and I suppose that is probably, as you say, kind of influenced by the world of professional sport. From your experiences and the people that you've again worked with, and equally the people that you know that are in the world of work in a bit more of that kind of corporate environment, how have you found that kind of reacting to that feedback? Because again, going back to the professional side of things, it can be pretty brutal, and it can be, you can get called out, and you don't tend to get that as much within the can happen, but as much within the kind of corporate environment. What are your thoughts on that side of things, and actually, I suppose, adapting to that as well from an ex-professional player into the corporate world, or the companies that you worked with and how they've run their processes?
I do think it's quite a common challenge for athletes to temper their feedback when they go into those environments. And I think, but in a way, actually, it can be a strength to be a bit more informal and to be if you can couch it in the right way and you can come at it with a little bit of a kind of cut through, you almost have the license to cut through some of the usual sort of niceties around it. But it has to be respectful, of course, and it has to be respectful in the sporting environment as well, because otherwise people won't listen to you. I think for myself, having written some books, not all the feedback is positive to those books. So it's something that sometimes someone totally anonymous online, on Amazon or wherever else, and they just don't like it. And it, to begin with, that does sting, of course. But, after a while, a bit like with being a sports person, it's just part of the job. And actually, you've got to kind of, I think great leaders, when you see them in sports teams, great leaders have a lot of equanimity. They're never too up or too down. They celebrate, when it's over, but they don't get too emotionally carried away during the flow of a game. And you can think of these leaders, they look quite stoic during these games. And I think that's actually something that's good for everybody. It's okay, there's feedback coming in. Don't get too carried away either way, good or bad. Is it useful to you? Is it not? Where's it coming from? Have they got a point? Have you got a blind spot? And actually, not all feedback is useful. Sometimes someone might say something and you're like, okay, I can take that. But, maybe if a few people say something similar, you're like, okay, there might be something in that. But if one person says something, maybe they're not that well informed or whatever, you've just got to kind of push it aside.
Yeah, I think the stoicism and leadership element is very interesting, because I think, again, you always assume that if you can be a leader on the field or a leader when you're playing, that translates directly to off the field and into the corporate environment, but that doesn't necessarily always happen. Look, you mentioned there around the books that you've written, and I think you'll be the first to admit that it's not the most often led path from professional athlete to author. So, what made you move into this? What was your transition process? Having played at London Scottish, having gone from kind of semi-pro, pro, and fully aware most people will be of the challenges playing in a league like the Championship in rugby. What was your process in that transition from professional to life after professional, and what made you, I suppose, become the author that you are?
It was an emergent process, I think it's fair to say. And I was turning 30. I was playing in France. It was my 4th season, and I'd always felt like I was moving forward, on or off the field, preferably both at the same time. And in that final season, I really felt like, this is actually just a year that I'm, there were some administrative issues with the team, and I really felt like I was wasting a year, which when you're turning 30 in sport is a bit of a line in the sand. You're like, okay, this is definitely getting closer to the end now. And I felt like rather than scratch out a few more years, I'm better off taking on this transition now than I am at 35, when I might have dependence and some more stressors on the rest of my life. And so, I prepared for that. I had an English literature degree, which was, useful for everything and nothing, as people who've done English literature degrees are probably well aware. And I kind of picked up little bits of work while I was playing. I did the odd bit of freelance writing, contributed to some consultancy reports in and around sport, did some sort of different qualifications, testing the water with different things. And after I left rugby, I picked up some more writing. So I did a couple of courses online. I started picking up little assignments, and actually once I published something in my own name, so I'd done some ghostwriting and various other bits and pieces, I published something in my own name about sporting transition and put it on LinkedIn, and it got quite a lot of traction. People started bringing me more writing work relating to rugby. And as I was doing that, it got me used to pitching stories and thinking of ideas to send in. And I naturally came up with a whole list of other things that weren't relevant for them, were, more about me and my career and the things I thought about the game and life, like you say, at that level outside the Premiership that people don't really see. And the more that, I worked on those, and I was almost just practicing building them out. And I thought, suddenly the kind of idea for the book, the concept coalesced. And then at the same time, once I read some other sports books that had maybe a similar perspective or a structure that I liked, I thought, okay, if I marry these things up, I think I've got something. And, I always loved books. It was growing up, it was sports and books were my things. And I just came to this point where you could actually write a book here. Like you've always told yourself you'd like to write a book. You actually, the time, the topic, everything else, do you really want to do it or not? And I thought, yeah, I will actually. I think I do want to be the person that follows those things through. So I turned down some work at the time, so it was a little bit of a risk, but I committed to doing it and building that out. And then at the same time, through some of those processes, I actually picked up some other kind of freelance work while I was doing it, so I could juggle the two. And I just nudged the project on, and it ended up taking about a year, which was pretty fast. But for me, it was not only kind of fulfilling a personal ambition, but it was also a bit of a statement of sort of capacity. It was like, look, I can do work like this. What else is out there? So for me, the book was both a sort of storytelling, an exercise in storytelling. It was a sort of personal ambition, but it was also, I want some work.
Yeah. Doing something like that, which ultimately is put it in a very crude way, a business development opportunity for you. And I think what's interesting there is actually the thought process that you went through in terms of doing work whilst you were coming towards the end of your career, and having worked in the professional environment within sports clubs, it's not something that is, certainly 5 years ago, is not something that was thought about at all. You were there to play rugby or play football, and that is it. Now that's changed a considerable amount, and a lot of the work that I did when I was at Quins was around that player transition with one of the partners that we had there, which is really focusing in on, actually, as a professional rugby player, you're very unlikely to reach 35 at the top of your game. Very, very unlikely. And so how do you then enter that world of work, as you say, at 27, 28, 29, 30, when you're 5-10 years behind your peers in that regard? And the fact that you kind of had that plan is really interesting, because I'm not sure that many, I don't know, you'd be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm not sure that many of your fellow teammates would have had that plan.
No, I think people don't like to think about it. I think you're probably giving me a little bit too much credit, because it was something that I always thought about, and it was always something that you should do more with. I think because I was in France, I had a lot of energy dedicated to learning French to begin with. Yeah. So that was also a sort of good excuse to not think about what I was going to do the rest of my life. But yeah, I do think in general it is something people will go out of their way to avoid thinking about, because it is like thinking about, the end of your career is quite an emotive topic, and depending on how closely you identify with being a pro athlete as well, it can be a really difficult transition, regardless of the level that you compete at, actually. And I think I know it's a little bit more professional over there, but even if you're a college athlete, a university athlete, you're not actually really getting paid. I mean, a lot of top Olympic athletes barely get paid, and those are people, in a way, because they're not being paid, they actually sort of almost emotionally identify being an athlete more than someone who's just, happy to pick up their paycheck as a pro footballer might. And there's a lot of very serious common problems, for athletes across the spectrum of, sport, level of competition, demographic, all the rest of it. And so in the latest book I've done, Endgame, that's a handbook for athletes who are kind of approaching, how to approach transition from sport to something else. And it's not everything's relevant for everyone, but I'm pretty confident that in there'll be something that's useful for an athlete at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, not to give you any more credit at all there, but I still think that there are very few athletes that do prepare. But I think going back to your actual kind of looking at, athletics or that side of things, and certainly the Olympics being on at the moment, and actually I find that because they are not paid in a particularly good way, let's put it politely, and unless you're, again, at the very, very top, actually they tend to be very, very resourceful in finding their own sponsors and working really fucking hard in order to increase the income that they can to follow that dream ultimately of being an Olympian or whatever that is. And I think you don't necessarily get that within team sports because of the other commercial kind of imperatives of teams and those different types of things. But obviously, kind of coming back to the content side of things, you mentioned the two of the books you've written. You've written a third. You're on your way to a fourth. Content is a really big thing for you, and obviously, it's kind of created all of these opportunities post your career. I kind of want to delve into that creating content for opportunities side of things, and what led you to think about that and work with the clients on that side of things in terms of, right, these are the opportunities that you can create by creating content.
I think you slightly touched on the sort of business development phrase, and it is a business development tool, and it scales, without your effort later on, and you can share it again. You can send it to people who you think might be interested. It's a conversation starter. It proves, whatever format it's in. It might be a book. It could be a blog post. It could even be a really good Twitter thread or a LinkedIn piece or a podcast episode or whatever it is. It's proof of work, and it's proof that you've considered the topic, that you've cared enough to do something about it. And I think if you're, going back to being an athlete, you are, like you said, you're behind people of a similar age in the world of work. But, you can prove that you do have some skills. You can formalize some of those skills, your business development, if that's, you're a solo athlete looking for sponsors. There's ways that you can tell those stories and prove a capacity for work that then works without you. It's like it's running in the background and you never know who might look at it. And my first kind of bigger role after leaving rugby was with a startup that was focused on helping these transition from sport to work. They had an open role and I applied, but it wasn't, they came back to me and they said, oh, we don't think this is necessarily the role for you, but actually, the stuff you've sent us, I'd made a little content project, like largely for my own benefit, around athletes leaving sport. And they said, but, we think that you could run our content for us and tell, stories of athletes, about our business. And that was a really fun role, great business. I was with them for like 2 years doing that. So that was super fun. And I think if you're early in a career or if you're changing career, startups are a great place to go because you get a lot of responsibility quite quickly. And even if the pay, might not be so good, depending, you actually get to prove a lot of different capacities and a lot of different directions very quickly that you can then, if you're smart about it, package up and go on to another role somewhere else that might have a bit more focus. But startups are interesting places to go and work if you're new to something, for sure.
And there's a lot of them about at the moment. But you mentioned there around if you're smart enough to package it up, and I think it kind of a few things that you touched on in that answer around, I suppose, proving you've got the skills and what you did in that job interview or job process in terms of you packaged up the content that you'd done, and actually that is effectively that's just doing the work that you need to do before you then go in and apply, because it's really beneficial to you. You wanted to do it, it helped you, but ultimately by doing that background work, it enabled you to be successful in an application, even regardless of the fact it wasn't for that specific role. And I think there's a bit of a theme that kind of comes up on the podcast quite a lot is there is a bit of a shift from necessarily candidates doing enough work to prepare for interviews and or even enough work to actually understand whether or not they want a job. And part of that is the ease of applying and lots of different new ways of applying. And part of that, I think, as well, is I actually find that a lot of people find it difficult to really articulate the value that they can add. And you kind of mentioned this kind of package up the skills element, but everybody, regardless of what they've done in the past, has a value to add. And whether that's coming straight out of university or school, whether that is transitioning from professional sport to business or to whatever, you have a value. You just need to be able to articulate it. Have you found that, I suppose again, probably utilizing your experience, but also the people that you played with or people that you knew. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of confidence to be able to put yourself out there and do that type of thing. Did you find that challenging to begin with yourself? But also, do you find that, I don't know, is a professional sports person, do they have more confidence in being able to do that because of the environments that they've been in, and therefore they kind of are able to go, you know what, this is what I'm worth, this is my value, a lot more than potentially somebody else would?
I absolutely hated it. Started and I say to people now, I completely misunderstood in sport that actually you are working a sales role and you are selling yourself. And I was very confident in team environments, so I was very confident speaking up. I was usually kind of in and around like leadership roles in the squads and stuff, but I was very happy to chime in internally, and I always felt like valued and that I understood what I could offer, and that I could have a difficult conversation without being too precious about it. But I think that actually I was awful at putting my hand up and being like, I think I'd be good for this. So once I left sport and I started down this line of writing, and one of the reasons I was doing ghostwriting in the first place was that I had no interest in putting myself out there and I hated the idea of it. But once I started developing these ideas around the book and things like that, I realized it was like, you're going to have to get over yourself if you want to do these things. Like this is something, and in a way, it's sort of, it can be a little bit egotistical. It's like, I shouldn't have to explain myself. I'm good at this. People should just notice. And the world's busy. It's fast moving. People aren't going to. So actually, I realized, I was like, this is actually just you. Really letting yourself down, actually. And so it's a constant sort of learning process, adaptation. Things have gotten more out of hand as I've done more camera facing things, making content online. But I sort of stepped up to it. First I did ghostwriting, then I wrote blogs for someone else, then I did something in my own name, then I was presenting Zoom seminars internally at my job, and then I thought, okay, well maybe I'll present something as myself and I'll do that publicly. And it's just giving myself incremental steps just to test my own boundaries and comfort zones and all of that stuff. And then when you look back 2 years, you think, why was I so nervous about doing that? But that's just how growth is.
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up pretty well there right at the end. That is ultimately how growth is, and I think we forget, and I'm certainly guilty of this as well. That's how we've learned from a child. You've learned by testing that boundary. Can I jump off this wall? Yes. Can I jump off the higher wall? Yes. Whatever it is, and then the fear factor comes in as soon as you become an adult, doesn't it? I can't jump off that wall, or I can't post that on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is such a good resource. I've called it on the podcast before a necessary evil because it is there. But it is a really, really useful resource in order to ultimately shout about yourself, and it's just sort of treading a fine line between selling yourself and being egotistical and everything is about you. But it's a resource there that can be utilized really well, and equally there's so many other resources now, Substack, and obviously you've got a very successful one of those as well, that can just help people amplify what they're doing and amplify their personal branding, if you want to use that term. And that's something that's really coming to the fore now. And I suppose people that the clients that you've worked with, is that something that is a real kind of emphasis for them, because they realize actually that they need to put themselves out there a bit more?
I think yes, and also these things, they sound self-aggrandizing, and they are a little, or they can be, but I think there are healthy ways of sharing. And I think sometimes, particularly when you're, a consultant, or if you're doing something that's in a sort of newer industry, or you're hoping to kind of break into something, then I think explaining what it is you're doing. I've had feedback from people where I've gone, oh, this week I've done these things, and that's all I've said. And then people go, oh, now I know ways that we could work together, because sometimes I look and I think, I don't really understand what's going on. So sometimes it's just, you don't have to say, I'm the best at this. You can just say, I have literally done these things. I think the other thing is that quite often when creating content, it's about putting the ladder down or helping the people who are, 2 steps behind you, not people who are 10 steps behind you, explaining a little bit about like what success looks like for you, what you would need, in your role. Or you don't have to make it all about you. It can be about sharing knowledge and things you admire even. Like, okay, you see someone else's work that you admire and you can say, oh, I admire this, for these reasons. Maybe that starts a conversation. But I think it doesn't all need to be, I am the very best at this and that is why you should do this. It's like, no, you can be a little bit softer if it's not your thing. Some people are perfectly happy to, stand up and shout about themselves, obviously, but a lot of us aren't. And I think there are other ways that you can share that feel a little bit more congruent who you are, I think.
Yeah, I think that's certainly coming to the fore a little bit more nowadays, because we've kind of gone through that Instagram lifestyle of everything is great, everything's rosy, this is amazing, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm raking it in all the time, I'm overnight success. And actually people are now starting to go, well, that's not true, or this is very clearly airbrushed for want of a better term. And I think that's a positive sign of where we're coming and where we're becoming, certainly in a work environment of, yes, you can shout about how you helped deliver something that led on to success, but you don't then have to go, this is me, I'm brilliant, I can do all this, I've done all this. Again, it kind of it I suppose treads that fine line. You mentioned there around working with people and the kind of almost the ladder approach, as it were. Do you have a set way of working with people? Is it very bespoke? What's the kind of approach from your side?
I think it depends. Yeah, it obviously depends what we're doing. I think with writing, if we're creating written content or even video content, really, it's a bit sort of really figuring out who they are. So there's a sort of, I have a load of questions, a bit sort of, I think a lot of copywriters would probably have things in common, but it's like, who are you? What your values are. I'd love to know who you think you're talking to. Are these things, do they all line up? And it's just getting a really clear idea of like, okay, is this exactly like who you are? Let's get that clear and let's go from there. And I think the other side is working backwards. It's like, who do we want to talk to, and starting at that end. But I think it varies a lot. It's like, okay, which way working? Are we working like, bottom up or top down? And then kind of using that to like inform what we do. And I think I'm probably maybe a little more informal. So I've not been like big corporate, I've not like had an office job, I suppose, but being in with startups at a certain time, I'm quite like, okay, where do we want to go? Let's get that done quite efficiently. And I think people appreciate that. And I think that's quite a sports person's mentality, because a lot of sport isn't about, being on your feet every hour of the day. It's about thinking, okay, exactly what is the best thing that we can do right now with this time? Let's get that done and then let's rest, and I think work could benefit from being a little bit more like that.
I think a lot of what you said there can so easily be related to and extrapolated into the work environment, but also specifically, from a candidate's perspective, the interview process or preparing for that interview process. Who are the people I'm speaking to? What do they want? How am I going to understand what effectively their problem is that I've got to go and solve or try and solve? And then how does my value, and again comes back to this point about being able to articulate that, but how does my value then actually help solve that problem? But equally from an interviewer perspective, from a hiring organization perspective, actually being able to understand, right, what do we want from this person in this role? Yes, it's an account manager, account director, a finance manager, whatever that might be. Yes, you've kind of got the generic skills and the tick box element of what you need to do for a job, but what do we actually need from this person? What does good look like in 12 months' time? And I don't think that necessarily happens a huge amount.
I think what's great about this is that I've actually got a book project coming out called Super Strengths, and in high performance sport, this is a concept that is being bandied around a little bit more often, and actually, to your point, would make perfect sense. It's like, okay, what exact quality do we need for this? And I think if you're the candidate, we talk about it in the book, we explain the concept. A super strength is, as it sounds, your best quality? What are you better at? What is the one thing? And the more specific it is, the better in a lot of ways. What is that one thing that you can offer above and beyond everybody else? And knowing your super strength requires, we explain, in more detail, but it's self-awareness and self-efficacy. And those things are some things, self-awareness is very much developed by yourself, but self-efficacy sometimes requires feedback. So it's almost like, okay, you need evidence of what you've done. And I think the other way that you can develop a super strength or package up a super strength is by combining a few disparate qualities, being like, okay, I'm top 25% at these three things. And when you put those all together, I have one very specific skill set that is actually quite rare. And I think when you're hiring, you obviously think, okay, what one quality would make someone great for this role? And then I think as a candidate, if you have that quality, you see the role and you think, right, I am actually really, really good in this direction. Let me figure out how to best explain that, preferably with some evidence or, some anecdotes even of when you've done that before. But I think, knowing exactly what you're hiring for and knowing exactly why you might be hired is super important. I remember in sport, there was a time I wasn't being selected for one of the teams I was at, and I went to speak to the coach and he said, what are you, he was the forwards coach. So I was a back, so he wasn't someone I dealt with a lot. And he said, what are you good at? Like, why are you here? And I said, I'm running with the ball. And he said, yeah, so you should do that more often. And you're just like, okay, but I feel like, in these ways I don't get to. And he said, okay, well, why don't you think about doing these things? And, now I've had that conversation, you can go and do that. But it meant he knew why I was there. I knew what I was good at. There was something that was stopping me from expressing myself, and he gave me the leeway to go away and do that. So it was like, well, that was a healthy interaction, But it was one of those things where you just have to line that up, between the two of you, between management and talent, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the heart, and we don't have time to get into this, but that goes to the heart of a good coach, good leader, good manager versus not, and actually going, this is what I can identify, how I can help you and how I can coach you. And I think the best managers ultimately and the best leaders are fundamentally coaches. And I think that's one of the big things that you can take. But look, Ben, I'm very conscious of time. And you're a very busy person, so I don't want to take up too much more of it. But before we get to the last question, I'm just going to say, obviously, we'll put all the links to the books, etc., in the show notes. When is the new one coming out?
Very soon. Just finalizing the cover, but I think in the next month, hopefully, next month, 6 weeks, it should be available. So I'm going to be recording the audio in the next 2 weeks. So I think we'll probably be ready to go pretty soon. And I'm excited.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. But right. As the listener knows, we normally ask 3 quickfire questions. But again, I'm going to change it slightly. And I want to really focus in on something we mentioned earlier around the kind of content and the opportunities side. And this might be a challenge. But what is the one piece of advice, if you can distill it down into just one, that you can give me if I was starting out on a journey of wanting to create opportunity through content?
I'm going to say 2 things. I think one, to begin with, I think take a lot of low consequence shots on goal if you can. If you're unclear about what you want to do, like in terms of exactly where you're aiming, take a lot of shots on goal, see what resonates with yourself. And then once you figure that out, do the best you can to make one very clear piece that is, like we said in the hiring, is targeted at exactly who you want to be talking to. Like, what exactly do they want to know or to hear? What exact skills do they need to see, or even exact interest? And when you've got that one piece, then I think actually that can do quite a lot for you. You can always append it to applications. You can message people and say, what do you think about this? There's different ways you can use it. I think to begin with, it's probably like a broader approach, and then try and focus that in to make one standout piece, I would say.
That's a perfect way to end. So Ben, look, thanks very much for coming on Talent Talks. I really appreciate the time for you to come in. It's been a really, really good chat. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.